Attention listeners! What would you do if you faced 70 Apache warriors, staring you down in eerie silence? This is the gripping tale of Sterling Maddox, a lone cowboy who made a choice that changed his destiny forever. Sterling Maddox stared at the horizon, where 70 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, watching him. They had been there since dawn, silent as carved stone, neither advancing nor retreating, just watching. He touched the empty holster at his side, not for a weapon he didn't have, but for reassurance that felt just as absent. Hold your breath, folks, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Yesterday, this same ridge had been empty. Yesterday, he had made a choice that seemed simple. Yesterday, he had given his only horse to carry a wounded Apache woman to safety, leaving himself stranded 20 miles from the nearest settlement. Now, those 70 warriors held something in their hands that made no sense. Each one carried a single white feather, but Sterling had never seen Apaches use white feathers for anything. Not for war paint, not for ceremonies he'd heard about. Nothing. The woman, Ayana, she had whispered her name before losing consciousness, was nowhere to be seen among them. Sterling had expected arrows. He had expected war cries. He had expected to pay for crossing into Apache territory, even with good intentions. Instead, they just watched him, and that silence felt more dangerous than any battle cry ever could. Because in all his years on the frontier, Sterling knew one thing that never changed. Apaches always had a reason for everything they did, and whatever reason brought 70 warriors to sit in perfect formation, holding white feathers while staring at a single unarmed cowboy. That reason was something he couldn't begin to understand. But as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows between him and the silent warriors, Sterling began to realize that giving away his horse had set something in motion, something that followed rules he didn't know existed, something that would demand more from him than he ever imagined possible. The question wasn't what they wanted from him. The question was what he had already agreed to, without knowing it. The memory of yesterday burned in Sterling's mind as he studied the motionless warriors. He had been riding through the canyon when he heard the soft moan echoing off the rock walls. Following the sound, he found her collapsed beside a dried creek bed, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage around her leg. The wound looked infected, and fever made her skin hot to the touch. Any sensible man would have ridden away. Apache territory meant death for trespassers, and helping one of their women could be seen as an insult or worse. But something in Ayana's dark eyes had stopped him cold, not pleading exactly, but a kind of resigned dignity that reminded him of his own sister in her final moments. Sterling had lifted Ayana onto his horse without a word. She was too weak to protest, drifting in and out of consciousness as he led the animal on foot through the rocky terrain. For 6 hours, he walked beside his horse, while she slumped in the saddle, occasionally whispering words in Apache that he couldn't understand. When they finally reached the edge of her territory, marked by 3 distinctive red stones, he had helped her down and watched her stumble toward a cluster of traditional dwellings in the distance. Then he had done something that still made no sense to him. Instead of taking his horse back, he had slapped the animal's flank and sent it after her. The horse followed Ayana like a faithful dog, and Sterling had stood there, empty-handed, watching his only valuable possession disappear into Apache land. Now, 18 hours later, his legs ached from walking through the night. His water was nearly gone, and 70 Apache warriors were treating him like some kind of puzzle they needed to solve. The white feathers caught the morning light, but their meaning remained as mysterious as the silence that stretched between the ridge and where Sterling stood. One of the warriors, a man with grey streaking his black hair, raised his hand slightly. The others responded instantly, shifting their horses into a different formation, not threatening, but deliberate, calculated, like pieces moving on a chessboard. According to rules Sterling had never learned. The lead warrior began to descend the ridge, still holding his white feather. The others remained perfectly still, but Sterling could feel their attention like a physical weight. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But where could he go on foot in this endless landscape? As the warrior approached, Sterling noticed something that made his blood chill. The man wore a necklace made of small bones, and hanging from his belt was a scalp of brown hair that looked disturbingly familiar. The color matched Sterling's own hair exactly, but the warrior's eyes held no anger, no bloodlust. Instead, they showed something far more unsettling. They showed expectation, as if Sterling was supposed to understand something that remained completely beyond his grasp. The warrior stopped 10 feet away and spoke a single word in Apache. Then he pointed directly at Sterling's chest and repeated it, his voice carrying an odd note of reverence that made absolutely no sense at all. The Apache word hung in the air between them, like a challenge Sterling couldn't meet. The warrior's weathered face showed no aggression, but his eyes demanded some kind of response that Sterling didn't know how to give. Behind him, the 70 mounted warriors remained statue still, their white feathers creating an eerie contrast against the harsh morning sky. Sterling cleared his throat and tried the universal language of peace, raising both hands slowly. I don't want trouble. I helped your woman because she was hurt. That's all. The warrior tilted his head slightly, as if Sterling had said something interesting, but wrong. He repeated the Apache word, this time placing his hand over his heart, and then gesturing toward the ridge where Ayana had disappeared yesterday. When Sterling still showed no understanding, the warrior did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a man wore when he knew a secret that would change everything. The warrior reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out an object that made Sterling's stomach drop. It was his horse's bridle, the one he had custom made with distinctive silver conchos that his father had given him. But the leather was decorated now with small painted symbols that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. The warrior held up the bridle and spoke again, using different Apache words, but with the same tone of reverence. He pointed at Sterling, then at the painted symbols, then back at Sterling. The meaning was unmistakable. These symbols represented something about what Sterling had done, and that something was significant enough to bring 70 warriors to attention from the ridge. A new sound drifted down, singing, high voices weaving together in a harmony that raised the hair on Sterling's arms. But this wasn't a war song. He had heard Apache war songs before, and they sounded nothing like this. This melody carried celebration, gratitude, and something else he couldn't identify. Something that sounded almost like mourning. The warrior noticed Sterling's confusion and nodded approvingly, as if Sterling's ignorance was exactly what he expected. He tucked the bridle back into his pouch and pulled out something else, a second white feather, identical to the ones carried by the other warriors. He offered it to Sterling with both hands, speaking softly in Apache. Sterling stared at the feather. Accepting it felt like agreeing to something he didn't understand, but refusing it might be worse. The warrior waited patiently, still holding the feather between them, while the singing from the ridge grew stronger and more complex. Finally, Sterling reached out and took the feather. The moment his fingers touched it, the warrior nodded with deep satisfaction and turned to signal the others. Immediately, the entire formation began to move, not towards Sterling, but parallel to his position, as if they were preparing to escort him somewhere. But escort him where? And why did accepting a simple feather feel like he had just signed a contract, written in a language he couldn't read? The singing continued, and Sterling realized with growing unease that the melody was getting closer. More voices were joining in from somewhere behind him. When he turned around, His heart nearly stopped. Emerging from a canyon he hadn't even noticed was a procession of Apache women and children, led by an elderly man wearing an elaborate feathered headdress. And there, walking beside the elder, but moving slowly due to her injured leg, was Ayana. She was alive, conscious, and staring directly at Sterling with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that looked disturbingly like pity. The elderly man with the elaborate headdress approached Sterling with steps that suggested both ceremony and purpose. His weathered face carried the kind of authority that came from decades of making decisions that affected entire tribes. Behind him, the procession of women and children maintained their singing, but Sterling could see them watching his every movement with intense curiosity. Ayana limped forward, favoring her injured leg, but moving with determination. When she reached Sterling, she spoke to him in careful English, her accent thick, but her words clear. "My grandfather wishes to thank the white man who gave life back to his granddaughter." Sterling felt his confusion deepen. "I just helped someone who was hurt. Anyone would have done the same thing." Ayana translated his words to the elder, who listened intently and then spoke back in rapid Apache. His tone suggested he was correcting something important. Ayana nodded and turned back to Sterling, her dark eyes serious. "My grandfather says you speak words that are not true. Most men would not have helped. Most white men would have ridden past, or worse. But you gave away your most valuable possession to save the life of an enemy. This is not what anyone would do. This is the action of someone who follows the old codes." The elder stepped closer and placed his hand on Sterling's shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice carried deep emotion that transcended language barriers. Ayana listened carefully before translating. He says, "You have honored the sacred law of the horse gift. When a warrior gives his horse to save a life, he binds himself to that life and that life's people. You did not know this law, but ignorance does not change the binding. You are now connected to our tribe in ways that must be honored." Sterling's mouth went dry. "Connected? How? What does that mean exactly?" The singing stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence felt ominous. The elder studied Sterling's face for a long moment, then spoke a single word in Apache. Every warrior on the ridge responded by raising their white feathers high above their heads. The gesture looked like a salute, but Sterling sensed there was more to it than simple respect. Ayana's expression grew troubled as she translated. He says, "The connection requires a choosing. The sacred law demands that the giver of the horse gift must now prove whether his heart truly matches his actions. If yes, he joins the tribe as family. If no—" She paused, glancing nervously at the armed warriors surrounding them. "If no, what?" Sterling asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "If no, the gift was a lie, and lies about sacred things must be punished. The horse would be returned to you, but your spirit would be considered poisoned. You would be marked as one who steals honor through false generosity." Sterling looked around at the 70 warriors, the elder's unwavering gaze, and Ayana's worried face. He was trapped between two choices he didn't fully understand, both of which would change his life forever. The white feather in his hand suddenly felt heavier than his missing horse, and he realized that his simple act of kindness had somehow triggered an ancient ritual that he was completely unprepared for. The elder spoke again, and this time his words carried the weight of finality. Ayana's translation hit Sterling like a physical blow. "The choosing ceremony begins at sunset. Until then, you are our guest. After sunset, you will be either our brother or our enemy. There is no third path." The Apache village was unlike anything Sterling had imagined. Hidden in a natural basin between towering rock formations, it consisted of traditional dwellings, arranged in precise patterns that spoke of generations of careful planning. What struck him most was the complete absence of hostility. Children watched him with open curiosity. Women nodded respectfully as he passed, and men studied him with expressions that suggested they were measuring something he couldn't identify. Ayana walked beside him, her limp more pronounced now, but her determination unwavering. You are wondering why no one shows fear or anger toward a white man in their sacred place, she observed. Sterling nodded. The thought had crossed my mind. I expected something different. Fear and anger are for enemies. You are not yet enemy, and you are not yet family. You are between worlds, which makes you sacred until the choosing ceremony reveals your true nature. She paused beside a large fire pit where several women were preparing food. My grandfather wants you to understand what you will face at sunset. They approached a dwelling larger than the others, decorated with symbols that seemed to tell stories Sterling couldn't read. The elder waited inside, seated on a woven mat with various objects laid out before him. Sterling recognized his horse's bridle among them, but there were other items too. A knife with an ornate handle, a small clay pot filled with what looked like paint, and a bundle of sage tied with sinew. The elder gestured for Sterling to sit across from him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ritual and tradition. Ayana translated carefully, pausing frequently to ensure accuracy. He says the choosing ceremony has 3 parts. First, you must demonstrate that your gift came from genuine caring, not from seeking advantage or glory. Second, you must show that you understand the sacred nature of sacrifice by making one yourself. Third, you must prove that you can put the welfare of the tribe above your own survival. Sterling felt cold sweat begin to form, despite the warmth of the dwelling. What kind of sacrifice? And how exactly do I prove that last part? The elder seemed to understand English better than he spoke it, because he responded before Ayana could translate. He picked up the ornate knife and held it so the blade caught the light filtering through the dwelling's entrance. Then he spoke in Apache, his tone grave and ceremonial. Ayana's face went pale as she listened. When she translated, her voice was barely above a whisper. The sacrifice is a test of trust. You must allow yourself to be bound and placed in a situation where only the tribe's mercy will save your life. If your original gift was pure, they will save you. If it was false, they will let you die as punishment for dishonoring their sacred laws. Sterling stared at the knife, understanding now why the 70 warriors had seemed so calm and expectant. They weren't here to fight him. They were here to judge him. And depending on that judgment, they would either welcome him as family or watch him die for the crime of false generosity. The elder set down the knife and picked up the clay pot. He dipped his finger in the paint and drew a symbol on his own forehead, then offered the pot to Sterling. The message was clear. The ceremony was already beginning, whether Sterling was ready or not. Outside, the sun had moved considerably toward the western horizon. Sterling realized with growing dread that he had perhaps 2 hours to decide whether to submit to a test that could easily kill him, or to try to flee across open country on foot while being pursued by 70 mounted warriors. Either choice seemed like a path to death, but one would at least preserve his honor in the eyes of people who had already shown him more respect than he deserved. Sterling took the clay pot with trembling hands, the weight of his decision settling on him like a stone. The paint was still warm from the elder's touch, and its earthy scent reminded him of the adobe church where his mother used to pray. He thought about her now, wondering what she would have told him to do in a situation that no Sunday sermon had ever prepared him for. The elder watched patiently as Sterling dipped his finger in the paint. The old man's eyes held no judgment, only the kind of steady attention that came from a lifetime of watching people face impossible choices. When Sterling finally drew the same symbol on his forehead that the elder wore, the old man nodded, with something that might have been relief. "You have chosen to trust us with your life," Ayana translated as the elder spoke. "Now we must prepare you for what comes at sunset." They led Sterling outside, where the entire village seemed to be in motion. Men were arranging stones in a large circle. Women were weaving long ropes from plant fibers. And children were gathering specific types of wood that Sterling didn't recognize. Everyone moved with the fluid efficiency of people who had performed these tasks many times before. But there was an underlying tension that suggested this ceremony was not routine. How often does this happen? Sterling asked Ayana as they walked toward the stone circle. The horse gift ceremony? Not often. Maybe once in a generation, if ever. Most people are not foolish enough to give away their only means of survival for a stranger. She paused, studying his face. Or brave enough. 3 young warriors approached, carrying what looked like ceremonial clothing. The elder spoke to them briefly, then turned back to Sterling. Through Ayana, he explained that Sterling must wear traditional Apache clothing during the ceremony, as his own clothes represented the world he was choosing to leave behind. As Sterling changed clothes, he noticed that the 70 warriors from the ridge had positioned themselves around the village perimeter. They were no longer watching him specifically, but their presence created an unmistakable message. There would be no escape once the ceremony began. The white feathers they carried were now attached to their horses' bridles, creating an eerie visual reminder of Sterling's commitment. "Tell me about the first test," Sterling said to Ayana as she helped him adjust the unfamiliar garments. "The one about proving my gift was genuine." Ayana hesitated, glancing toward her grandfather before answering. "You must speak truthfully about why you helped me, but not just speak. You must allow the tribe's wisest members to question you while you are bound and unable to defend yourself with anything but words. They will ask you things designed to expose any hidden motives, any selfishness, any lies you tell yourself about your own goodness." Sterling felt his stomach clench. "And if they decide I was lying to myself about my motives, then the ceremony ends immediately, and you are taken to the edge of our territory and released. Your horse is returned to you, and you are free to go. But you are also marked forever as someone who cannot be trusted, and no Apache will ever help you again, no matter how desperate your situation." The sun had moved noticeably lower, casting longer shadows across the village. Sterling could see that the stone circle was nearly complete, and several elders had gathered near it, discussing something in low voices. Their expressions were serious, and occasionally one of them would look in his direction with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "What happens if I pass the first test?" Sterling asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Ayana's expression grew grim. "Then you face the second test, the test of sacrifice. And that one, my new friend, is much more dangerous than having your motives questioned." The sun touched the horizon as Sterling found himself seated in the center of the stone circle, his hands bound behind his back with rope that felt stronger than leather. The entire village had gathered around the perimeter, their faces illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. The 70 warriors formed an outer ring, still as sentinels, their white feathers moving gently in the evening breeze. 5 elders sat facing Sterling, each one wearing elaborate paint designs that marked their status as judges in this ancient proceeding. The elderly man, who was Ayana's grandfather, sat in the center, flanked by 2 men and 2 women whose weathered faces spoke of decades spent making life and death decisions for their people. Ayana stood beside her grandfather, ready to translate, but Sterling sensed that some of these elders understood English better than they let on. The way they watched his face when he spoke suggested they were reading more than just his words. The questioning began gently. Why had he been in Apache territory? Sterling explained about searching for new grazing land after the drought had destroyed his small ranch. Where was his family? Gone, he told them honestly. His parents dead from fever. His sister from complications in childbirth. No wife or children of his own. Then the questions became more pointed. Had he helped Ayana because he hoped to gain something from the Apache people? Sterling denied this, explaining that he had expected nothing but trouble from his actions. Did he consider himself a good man who deserved reward for his kindness? This question made Sterling pause, because he wasn't sure how to answer honestly. I don't know if I'm good, he finally said. I just know that leaving someone to die when I could help felt wrong. The female elder to his left spoke in rapid Apache, her tone sharp and challenging. Ayana translated reluctantly. She asks, why you did not try to take me to your own people for medical care? Why give me to the Apache when you could have been seen as a hero among whites for saving me? Sterling felt sweat forming despite the cool evening air. The question cut to something he hadn't fully examined in his own mind. Because she belonged with her own people, taking her away from everything she knew would have been another kind of cruelty. The male elder to his right leaned forward and spoke a single sentence in Apache. Ayana's eyes widened as she translated. He says, you speak of cruelty, but you condemned yourself to walk 20 miles through dangerous country with no horse, no weapons, and little water. Was this kindness to yourself, or was it punishment for some guilt you carry? The question hit Sterling like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. His sister's face, as she died because he couldn't get her to a doctor in time. His parents' graves, that he had abandoned when the ranch failed. All the times he had chosen the safe path instead of the right one. Was saving Ayana an act of redemption, or just another way to hurt himself? Maybe both, he whispered. And the honesty of it surprised him. The 5 elders spoke among themselves, in voices too low for him to hear. Sterling watched their faces, trying to read expressions that revealed nothing. Finally, Ayana's grandfather stood and addressed the crowd in ceremonial tones that carried across the entire village. When he finished speaking, Ayana approached Sterling with tears in her eyes. You have passed the first test. The elders believe your heart was true when you helped me. She paused, wiping her face. But now comes the test of sacrifice. And I must warn you what they are about to ask of you. Even I do not know if I could do it. 2 young Apache men approached Sterling with a wooden box that they set down beside him with reverent care. When Ayana's grandfather opened it, Sterling saw the contents and felt his blood turn cold. Inside were 5 arrows, each one marked with a different colored band and a small piece of leather with symbols painted on it. The elder lifted the leather and showed it to the crowd, speaking in ceremonial tones that carried across the silent village. When he finished, Ayana approached Sterling with obvious reluctance. The test of sacrifice requires you to choose which member of our tribe will face danger to prove your worthiness, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 of our people have volunteered to risk their lives for your ceremony. The arrows represent different trials, each one dangerous but survivable if the person is skilled and blessed with luck. Sterling stared at the arrows, horrified. I don't understand. I'm supposed to choose someone else to risk their life for me. That's not sacrifice. That's cruelty. That is exactly the point, Ayana replied. The test measures whether you will allow others to suffer for your benefit or whether you will find another way. Many who take this test choose an arrow immediately, thinking that someone else's risk is acceptable payment for their own acceptance into the tribe. The elder spoke again, and Ayana continued translating. But there is another choice. You can refuse to select an arrow, and instead offer to face all 5 trials yourself. This has never been done, because no one can survive all 5 trials alone. It would be certain death. Sterling felt the weight of an impossible decision crushing down on him. Around the circle, he could see 5 Apache volunteers standing ready. There was a young man, barely out of boyhood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, an older warrior with scars marking his arms, a teenage girl who reminded him painfully of his dead sister, and a man about his own age with a wife and small children visible in the crowd behind him. "What are the trials?" Sterling asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't help his decision. Ayanna pointed to each arrow in turn. The red arrow means crossing the rapids at Devil's Canyon at night. The black arrow means entering the cave where the mountain cat dens and retrieving a stone from the deepest chamber. The white arrow means climbing the cliff face that no one has successfully climbed in living memory. The yellow arrow means walking alone into the territory of the rival tribe that killed 3 of our people last spring and returning with proof of peaceful contact. The blue arrow means, she paused, her voice breaking slightly, allowing yourself to be bitten by a rattlesnake and relying on traditional medicine to save your life. Each trial represented almost certain death, and Sterling was expected to choose which innocent person would die for his acceptance into a tribe he had never asked to join. The 70 warriors watched from their positions around the village perimeter, their white feathers now seeming less like decoration and more like markers for a funeral that had not yet happened. Sterling closed his eyes and thought about his sister's final words to him. She had told him that real courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about doing what was right, even when fear consumed you. She had also told him that some things were worth dying for, and protecting innocent people was at the top of that list. When he opened his eyes, Sterling looked directly at Ayanna's grandfather. "I won't choose an arrow. If someone has to face these trials for my acceptance, it will be me." All 5 trials tonight, the elder's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes that might have been respect. The crowd murmured in surprise, and the 5 volunteers looked at Sterling with expressions ranging from relief to amazement. But it was the reaction of the 70 warriors that surprised him most. As one, they removed the white feathers from their horses' bridles and raised them high above their heads, creating a forest of pale plumes against the darkening sky. Ayanna's grandfather rose slowly from his seated position, his weathered face showing deep emotion as he studied Sterling's resolute expression. The elder spoke in Apache, his voice carrying across the silent village, with the authority of absolute decision. When he finished, the 70 warriors responded with a sound Sterling had never heard before, a low rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the earth itself. Ayanna stepped forward, tears streaming down her face as she translated her grandfather's words. He says, "No man in the history of our people has ever offered to face all 5 trials alone. Such willingness to die, rather than cause harm to innocent people, proves a heart that is already Apache, whether the blood runs Apache or not." The elder continued speaking, and his next words caused visible shock among the assembled crowd. Ayanna's voice shook as she translated. He says, "The trials are ended. You have already passed the test of sacrifice by proving you would rather die than allow others to suffer for your benefit. The horse gift law is satisfied, and you are declared brother to our tribe." Sterling felt confusion mixed with relief. "But I haven't actually done anything yet. I just said I would." The elder smiled for the first time since Sterling had met him, and when he spoke again, his words carried gentle wisdom. Through Ayanna, he explained, "The trials exist to reveal the heart, not to cause death. A man who chooses certain death over possible harm to others has shown his heart completely. No further proof is needed." What happened next took Sterling's breath away. The 70 warriors dismounted in perfect unison, and began walking toward the stone circle. As they approached, each one knelt and placed his white feather at Sterling's feet, then removed something from his belt or saddle pack. Sterling watched in amazement as a pile of offerings grew before him. Beautifully crafted knives, hand-woven blankets, carved jewelry, and finally, one warrior brought forth Sterling's own horse, now wearing new Apache tack, decorated with symbols of honor and respect. The lead warrior, the same gray-haired man who had first approached Sterling that morning, stepped forward and spoke in careful English. "White brother, we came here to witness judgment. We expected to take a body away for burial, or to escort a new tribal member to our camps in the mountains. We did not expect to meet a man worthy of the greatest honor our people can bestow." "What honor?" Sterling asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. The warrior smiled. "You are invited to carry the protection of 70 families. Each feather represents a warrior's pledge that your safety is as important as the safety of his own children. Each gift represents a household that will shelter you, feed you, and defend you as long as you live. This has been given to only 3 white men in all our history, and never before to a man who was not born among us." Akayana's grandfather approached Sterling and placed both hands on his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of sacred ceremony. He says, "You came to us as a stranger who gave a gift. You leave as a brother who receives 70 gifts in return. Your horse was returned with honor markings that will ensure safe passage through any Apache territory. But more than that, you have shown our people that some white men understand the true meaning of courage and sacrifice." Sterling mounted his horse, feeling the weight of 70 white feathers tied to his saddle and the warmth of acceptance he had never expected to find. As he prepared to leave the village, the entire tribe gathered to see him off, their faces showing respect that would have been impossible to imagine just hours before. Ayana approached his horse one final time. "Where will you go now, brother?" Sterling looked toward the horizon where his old life waited, then back at the Apache village, where he had discovered something about himself he never knew existed. "I think I'll head north toward the mountains. I hear there's good grazing land up there, and it seems I have some new neighbors to get to know." The 70 warriors mounted their horses and formed an honor escort. As Sterling rode out of the village, their presence around him felt like protection. Family and home all at once. The white feathers on his saddle caught the starlight, marking him forever as a man who had been tested by fire and emerged as something greater than he had ever imagined possible. If you enjoyed this unforgettable Western tale of destiny and courage, head over to Narrative Sphere and click the video on your screen now to watch another epic story where bravery and fate collide in ways you'll never expect. Don't forget to subscribe to Narrative Sphere and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more incredible stories like these.